Am I good to go?
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, all good. I'll get started in just 1 second. The international and US medical community is in consensus. The US should not reopen. There have been 1.5 million cases of coronavirus, almost 100,000 deaths. And although the rate is slower than it was before, it is still one of the highest rates in the entire world. From opening opposition, you're going to hear 4 things. First, what we support on our side of the house. Secondly, the case for why this will make COVID-19 far worse, and worse in a way in which we cannot control it. Thirdly, what impact this will have on workers' rights. And fourthly, why the case from opening government is not convincing. Firstly, let's talk about what we support on our side of the house. We would keep the US closed until such a time as medical professionals suggest that we reopen it. And at that point in time, we would reopen it in staggered, limited openings. Contrast that to what opening government support. They try to squirrel the motion and tell you the model that they would support. Note this is an empirical debate, and the burden on opening government is to defend Trump's version of reopening. That is a fast, rapid reopening that does not take into consideration the recommendations of the medical community. That is the burden they must deal with. With that in mind, why will Trump's version of reopening make COVID-19 far, far worse? The first thing we're going to do is be generous to the government bench and assume that people will follow the measures insisted to them by the states. Those measures are things like social distancing laws and things like limited amount of time in contact with other individuals. Under those circumstances, COVID-19 will still get far, far worse. There are 3 reasons for that. Firstly, the measures that are currently imposed by states are limited, and they are likely to be limited into the future. That is for the reason that states do not want to create a panic and want to have their citizenry believe that things are under control to protect their short-term election interests. But secondly, for the reason that they are often not in consultation with the medical community as per order of Trump. And thirdly, for the reason that many of the federal measures that have been put in place are coming directly from Trump, who notably has not been doing this. That is empirically true and is likely to be true into the future, which means following measures will not be sufficient now, do not take into account the way that COVID-19 will develop into the future and become stronger and more infectious, something that we cannot accurately measure at the time, which amplifies all of that risk. All of that should explain to you that even under the circumstances in which people follow the measures imposed by these states, and even if those measures are very good measures, COVID-19 will still continue to grow and it will continue to become deadly. But the case from opening opposition is that individuals will, on large, not follow the measures imposed by states, which magnifies the harm exponentially. Why is it the case that people will not follow these measures? 5 reasons. Firstly, by reopening, the state sends a message that things are fine. People don't believe the risk is as large as it previously was and are therefore likely to not follow those measures. Secondly, people do not respect government restriction in the US content as evidenced by the enormous amount of protests, which means that if people aren't willing to respect a lockdown, they're not going to respect any of the other measures being put in place. Thirdly, it is very difficult to comply with these measures even at the best of times. For example, if you work in a nail salon, part of your job is being within 1 foot of another individual. You literally cannot avoid that. Fourthly, people need to go back to those places for the employment opportunities that opening government tell them to, obviously tell us that they need to. And fifthly, businesses will need to compensate for lost revenue, so will aggressively hound customers in and will aggressively pursue things that have high degrees of contact in order to do that. What are the impacts of this COVID-19 now growing exponentially? Firstly, and very intuitively, there will be far more infections, which leads to far more sickness and far more death. And note that the harm of that is exponential, because at the point where very few people are following these guideline restrictions, COVID-19 is able to mutate and grow at a far higher rate. More sickness and more death leads to enormous utilitarian harms. Yeah, like people are literally dead. There is no harm that the opening government team can put to with stress for workers that could ever overcome the pain a family feels when their family member who is immunocompromised dies, or their family member is now bedridden for months due to this disease. But secondly, if the concern of opening government, which is largely economically focused, is the one that you care about, this makes the economic harms of COVID-19 far, far worse for 2 reasons. Firstly, in the short term, the greater degree of sickness means that workers won't be able to offer labor in the same way they previously would have been able to, stunting any economic growth they want to lay their hat on. But secondly, later shutdown is likely in this circumstance for the reason that it will continue to grow and we will need another shutdown. And the harm of that is that that shutdown will have to be far, far larger to contain a much worse outbreak, And secondly, the fact you will need two distinct shutdowns means it is far more disruptive to the economy than anything otherwise. That should explain to you neatly why our case beats opening government. We're happy to take closing government.
Yeah, so your alternative is basically that until medical professionals tell you you won't open up, that basically means you'll never open up because medical professionals don't care about the economic implications that OG talked about.
No, that is not true. Medical professionals care about economic implications. It's going to be very difficult for you to prove that. But the second thing to note is that medical professionals often are working in consultation with the government. If your case is we would never reopen, that is not true. We would reopen. Let's talk about my second point of substantive about the impact on workers' rights. Because at the point where the government does this, they rescind any ability they have to provide protections to workers who do not want to go back to work. Yeah, like the government can now say, we don't have to provide you job seeker. We don't have to provide you any kind of financial remuneration for the fact that you cannot work, because you can work. And at that point, workers have two options. Either they are coerced back into working in a dangerous environment, and just consider the impact on like immunocompromised workers in that circumstance, or you make the sensible choice not to go to work and protect your health. And in that circumstance, you have no government support. So perhaps it is a case that some workers are struggling now. Imagine the millions of US workers who will choose not to go back to work, who will now have no ability to get any kind of financial support from the government. All of that carries an enormous harm. But additionally, this also sets a dangerous precedent with respect to businesses like Tesla being able to pressure the state to prioritize those businesses' powers over the protections of workers. My second speaker will talk about that more. Let's finally deal with the case that we get from opening government, which is basically a cookie cutter case, which is just like, it's good if people can work. The main thing to note here is that the economy will not bounce back in the way they suggest it will for the two reasons. Firstly, the businesses that can survive already have. It's been a protected lockdown. They are the ones who have survived. Those that haven't have already collapsed. The harm is already as large as it reasonably can be. But secondly, the large majority of the harms to businesses like, worker rights and blah, 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 are already being subsidized by the government. The on-costs have already been frozen, which gives the ability for them to continue to work. Prioritize people's lives. Don't prioritize the ability of a McDonald's worker to now be screwed out of government protection.
Yeah, just 1 second. Yeah, am I audible? Abhilaksh, can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, sure. Yeah, just let me know whenever you're ready. Okay, cool. Panel, firstly, we'd like to clarify that the model that we set up in terms of the steps we want to take to reopen the economy are not vastly different from what the states have already done. Therefore, it's sort of like a straw man for opening opposition to claim that these are completely diverse set of rules that will govern the actual empirical reopening versus what we are defending in this debate. States have given similar restrictions and similar guidelines as to what we have given to you in this debate. Now they give you structural reasons as to why you can't control the spread of the disease because of things like people not taking the reopening seriously in terms of thinking that it's all okay. But we tell you that in terms of the number of people who are protesting the continued shutdown, it's far fewer compared to the number of people who are supportive of like measures supportive of measures in terms of being socially distant. So in terms of going back to work as well, I think that people are likely to be cognizant of this idea of having social distancing because of the debilitating impact they've seen in terms of the lives lost as well as the number of cases increase in the US. I don't think we need to give like a strong visceral reaction to people in order for them to take it seriously. It already exists. But secondly, they tell you that some jobs require close contact, and that's why it's not going to be possible. We tell you that these jobs will obviously take further measures than other jobs will do. Your nail salon will further take in like masks and gloves and whatnot and constantly sanitize their work environments, etc. So there are steps that these people can take as well. We recognize that coronavirus is a highly infectious disease, but what we give to you preemptively from Prime Minister is that the current systems we have in place are able to handle this rate of infection and the risk that comes with the increase in rate of infection once we reopen, which means that we already have like the situation somewhat under control in terms of our recovery rate and the new number of cases being affected every day. But beyond that, we have enough personal protective equipment for the front lines. We have enough ventilators at this point so that the medical system is not overburdened, which was the case in Italy, which we saw in the beginning, right? That the medical system was so overburdened that they had to pick between whom to treat and whom not to. The impact of this is that even if the number of cases go up, the number of deaths are not likely to go up at the same rate. In that the mortality rate for the coronavirus, if there is a risk of increase post reopening of lockdown, is likely to be lower because of these structural reasons which are now in place, which we are able to handle given the 400,000 number of tests that US is able to carry out daily, which is what medical professionals also suggest we should do in order to curb coronavirus. Therefore, the eventual impact that opening opposition is pushing in terms of death being worse than anything else in terms of economy is not exactly true. Notice, however, that all of this argumentation happens in the best case scenario of opening opposition, in that they don't engage with the idea of people's livelihoods being lost at the point at which you extend lockdowns beyond the required amount of time. And like their mechanism for removing lockdowns is simply that when medical professionals say it's okay to remove lockdowns. Note here that medical professionals are hardly the final authority on when lockdown should be removed in comparison to the harms brought about economically, because what they are likely to or asked to portray on social media or on national television is their medical opinion on when coronavirus can be contained and the cases can be brought to zero. Therefore, they need to be scientifically accurate. This is the reason why Anthony Fauci does not say that like there is no chance of a secondary wave of coronavirus, but that if people have herd immunity, it's very unlikely that it could happen in the future. Therefore, relying on medical professionals in order to give you a green light in terms of when to reopen your economy is not necessarily strategic or correct. They haven't justified why they can balance the harms of like economic reopening versus like the harms of economy remaining closed versus the harms of coronavirus spreading further. They haven't given you any reasons as to say why medical professionals currently say that the system in place is not like sufficient to take care of an increase in cases from here on out, and that's why it's not comparative from their side, which is why our harms on like economic harms continue to stand in this debate. But let's look at the responses in terms of economic harms, right? They say that you won't have enough laborers. We're fine with that. Like the number of people who are able to go back to work currently can go down. They say next that it will trigger another lockdown because of increase in number of cases. Firstly, unresponsive to the idea that we have structures in place to take care of increase in number of cases from here on out. Secondly, if they don't respond to that idea, then it's highly speculative and therefore does not have enough like whatever measure, merit in the debate. Thirdly, they say that immunocompromised workers will get no government support from here on out. This is again uncomparative to the decisions that these workers are being forced to take in the event of governments continuing lockdowns because they don't have enough money to live another day, similar to the kind of situation that migrant laborers are facing in India. You won't tell them that since you're going to die, it's better that you walk to Uttar Pradesh from Bangalore. In the same way, we don't think that we can make opening opposition can make the decision for them in terms of like their risk to be becoming immunocompromised versus the no support that they're getting from the governments already. Therefore, at the end of the LO speech, they haven't responded to the basic comparative that we set up at the beginning of Prime Minister's speech, is that the lives that are at risk with the extension of the lockdown versus the likely risk in cases expanding when we do open up partially. And therefore, if we have given you enough mitigatory reasons to say that why we can control the increase and spread of the disease, it doesn't make sense for opposition to rely on only that as the argument for why we shouldn't care about economic harms. I'll take closing opposition. If you don't have one, yeah, opening, you can go.
Your case is reliant on me believing that you best protect the ability of workers to be financially secure. But our case explains to you why the best instrument for them to be financially secure, government assistance, is likely to be thrown out from under them when your policy is passed.
I think, again, you're not responding to the idea that millions of workers are still not covered by the government insurance that currently exists for them. And therefore, they, especially people who work on freelance work and don't have specific protections from any companies, are simply not able to get the kind of government assistance that you claim to have on your side. If it were the case that government assistance was enough, I don't think people would be asking for workers to protect their rights in the first place. Finally, we receive no response from them to the idea of the political risk that this carries in the future in terms of the kind of rhetoric that Trump and other Republicans have been pushing for states who are ignoring the economic cost to people in the United States. And therefore, if democratic governors extend the lockdown beyond what is justified by data-driven methods, it's likely to hurt them more in elections where they have to respond to ideas for why they didn't prioritize bringing the economy back online, especially in a case where other countries in Europe, who had similar trajectories for growth rate and mortality rates, have now reopened the economy. Therefore, I think on the comparative, we have a better situation in place for the workers as well as for the economies of these states, and a better representation of our political interests when we go into November, which is a crucial election for the Democrats as well. For all of those reasons, we propose.
You guys hear me okay? No? Can you not hear me okay? Okay, do I need to get a microphone? Okay, you can hear me, right. Unfortunately, this opening half is now contingent upon an empirical question of how bad is COVID at the moment in the United States. That is the first question I'm going to deal with and prove that it is sufficiently bad and sufficiently risky that this is a bad measure. Then I'm going to engage with why this makes COVID substantially worse. Then I'm going to whip our material about workers and engage with the economy. Finally, I'm going to bring some new substantive and engage with their idea that this hurts blue states. First, with respect to is COVID that bad? There are several reasons why you should believe this assertion, though obviously this is contested in the debate. The first is, as is conceded by opening government, the CDC and the World Health Organization have both recommended that they not open yet. The only response seems to be, well, the CDC is just trying to reduce it to zero. No, the CDC understands how hospitals work. They want to give enough time to hospitals, and they want to make sure that the infection rate is lower such that you can effectively reopen, right? Like the idea that the CDC is not in tune with rates of infection, knows that they are sufficiently high that reopening would be a bad idea and lead to very high infection rates that hospitals couldn't deal with is farcical. Second, they have the highest infection rate in the world. There are more than 1 million people who have been infected. The idea that this country is going to be fine seems farcical given that other countries that have had lower infection rates like Singapore have been forced to close down their economies again after reopening. Third, a large number of states have refused, 22 of them in fact, which seems to be a strong, plausible reason why you might consider, sorry, the time is paused on my, no, okay, cool. Why you might consider that it's very likely that there probably is still an issue, given that there isn't a consensus on this issue. The fourth thing to say is that the disease is fundamentally not understood properly. We do not understand its mutation rate. We do not understand how quick it travels. We do not understand how long it can remain latent in a system. For all those reasons, it seems unlikely that COVID is fine. And that is the only real leg to stand on in this debate, right? Once we pull that from under them, then we win the opening half. Now, why then have they reopened? It's the threat from Trump to revoke welfare rights, etc., and funding if they do not reopen. It is pressure from business owners lobbying those states in order to reopen, and it therefore creates pressure on other states to reopen as well if your neighbor is also like doing so. I don't think you have a POI from OO because we're OO. Right, so that is the most important thing in the debate because it proves that COVID is not fine. Therefore, the next question, does this make COVID worse? The only thing they say is twofold. First, people will social distance. This doesn't engage with a lot of the reasons we give you why they will not. Firstly, things like the temptation after having been deprived from human contact for a very long time. Stuff like the limited effectiveness of combating it via social distancing because it retains itself on things like surfaces. The fact that businesses have very strong incentives to reopen and not adhere to social distancing in order to get people engaged. So simply asserting it wasn't enough. They then say, well, you can take steps like masks. But this, firstly, as we've proven, is something that salons, for instance, have an incentive not to do. And they also have incentives to have more people in the shop in order to get more people and generate their money that they say that they are missing back. But additionally, there's just limits to how much you can do so, right? Like you cannot social distance away the fact that it sticks on surfaces, etc. So all of the reasons that we give that this makes COVID worse is not properly engaged with. Things like this gives businesses incentives to flaunt. Stuff like that the states that are most likely to reopen are those that are the most desperate and have the fewest measures in place. The message of complacency that Ollie talks about is entirely unresponded to. The only thing they say is social distancing measures exist, or we've given you substantive reasons to suspect that that is not enough, including the nature of COVID itself. Why is that so bad? Well, firstly, it literally leads to more people just getting infected, which both leads to more deaths in the short term, but also means that the economy likely has to be shut down again in the future, which is incredibly harmful in that respect. At the end of the day, if this was a question between the lives of innocent people who could not consent to your decisions versus a delay in the economy for a few weeks or a month, we ought to prefer that with respect to the impacting those people who are most vulnerable and those people that could die. But additionally, a new impacting opening opposition at DLO is to say that this also puts pressure on other states to reopen, states that are not ready, because there's a huge amount of pressure to say that you also need to reopen because that state that's next to you reopened and things look really good there. Next, with respect to the economy, this team says, well, a lot of people cannot get it because they are on contracts. 7 responses. First, this is just empirically untrue. Read the act that has actually been passed. Of the vast majority of contract workers are entitled to that. Second, new welfare programs are passed every day. Look at the Dems who literally today in the House of Reps passed a $3 trillion in stimulus package. Third, in most cases, those people can still work because as contractors, that like for the vast majority of jobs, you can find alternatives like working online, working limited hours, etc. Fourth, contract work is often insured or guaranteed over the length of a particular period of time, which means you are still entitled to arrears from that. Fifth, the counterfactual is that you guys force them back to work, which is extremely coercive and unfair. As Ollie tells you, to little response except, oh, but the money. Sixth, you often have families and nest eggs that you've saved up that you can also rely upon. There are other things that are more important here. But 7, at the worst case, you don't go back to work. You live on the most basic welfare for like a couple more weeks or a month or whatever. That's better than other innocent people potentially dying because of that decision. So the other material that we give you with respect to the economy is not engaged with. The idea that the businesses that can survive already have survived. The idea that government programs like rent and debt freezes mean that you aren't paying ongoing costs at this point. And fourth, the idea that there's limited opening. So that nail salon is either very, very open, seeing a lot of people, increasing the infection rate, or it's seeing very few people, in which case you're not getting your benefit. They're getting very little money. I'll take a point of information from closing.
Yeah. So just 2 days ago, Michael Ryan from WHO stated that we might have to live with COVID for a longer period of time because vaccine is not guaranteed it's going to be manufactured. Deal with that on your side.
Okay. One medical professional saying that it is a long-term problem does not mean that we should have reopened 4 weeks ago, right? And also you're going to have to grapple with the empirical facts and reasons we give you to believe the premise that this is incredibly harmful. Okay, let's engage with their reality about how this hurts blue states and some new substantive. The first thing I note about this hurting blue states material is it is entirely contingent upon them winning the other arguments in the debate, which they fundamentally have not, because at the point in which there are resurgences in Iowa and Ohio, and you have to shut down your economy again, those Republicans look really dumb and the Democrats look incredibly smart. Finally, precedent. We tell you firstly that there's been a massive amount of pressure to reopen from Trump, things like threatening to revoke funding from states. We then say that these states have kowtowed to this directly by reopening at his will. The problem with this is this sets a very concrete precedent that states should always do so, and additionally sets another incredibly dangerous precedent that it's okay to subjugate the rights of workers consistently in favor of some external threat to the economy, which is an extraordinarily dangerous precedent to set and flavors policy ongoing from there. At the end of the opening half, we proved that this was a serious problem, that freezing this economy for a little bit longer was probably worth not the risk of the cataclysmic risk of opening government. Proud to oppose.
Hello, am I audible? Yeah, just give me 10 seconds, I'll start. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think all the analysis that opening opposition provided about how this opening up is going to be ineffective or unsustainable because people are not going to follow things well. Nail salon in those nail salons, like COVID is going to spread like crazy and all of these things. All of these are reasons to believe that any eventual opening up that opening opposition wanted to defend, even if it is at the suggestion of medical professionals, is going to be significantly bad for all of the same reasons, right? Currently, the US government has a very strategic point and a strategic decision to make. We can indoctrinate people into social distancing and into following all the guidelines that we want them to follow, because currently we are in a very good position where even where people, while knowing that there is a huge economic trade-off to follow a lockdown, also are probably equally scared of the COVID-19 virus to begin with, right? At this point, we can very sufficiently and very powerfully indoctrinate them into following social distancing norms, wearing masks, etc., following all the other norms that can help us prevent the virus and all of these things, right? Notice that the context here is extremely important, right? In the vast majority of the cases, most medical professionals say that virus is a long-term battle, right? Even if you manufacture the vaccine in a year or something, even if you give up all the regulations that the US government has, it's necessarily going to be a long-term battle. Why is this the case? Biologically, viruses are known to keep on restructuring their RNA, and to that extent, once an RNA is sufficiently restructured, it becomes very difficult for existing viruses to deal with it. This is why we see repeat instances of many viruses that have happened in the past. Which is why there are already speculations of things like COVID-20, etc., and WHO and all of the other medical professionals have already given sort of a green light to it, right? In that context, we know that this is going to be a long-term battle. But even if the virus doesn't come back in a second wave, which is most likely going to happen, to the extent that the vaccine is still absolutely unclear, and it's absolutely unclear when it's going to be ready, and when are we going to be able to completely protect people from this virus, it's necessary that this is a long-term battle. At this point, it becomes absolutely important in this debate to ensure that people are able to the economy is able to open up while ensuring that people follow certain guidelines which increase the amount of safety that can be bestowed upon them, right? Which brings me to my first point of weighing in on the idea of this lockdown being significantly effective, because opening opposition has just thrown around this word called exponentially increase in a very problematic manner, right? There is sufficient mitigation to this about why lockdowns are not effective, and this is why many medical professionals, including the WHO, have claimed that the lockdown is not very effective against fighting a virus. Because notice that the effectiveness of lockdown is contingent on the distribution of the pandemic, right? If in a country of 1,000 people, only one person suffers from that virus, a lockdown is probably very good, right? Because there's a very low probability that you'll engage with that person on a day-to-day basis. The effectiveness of lockdown is mitigated in the case of US, because the number of people who are suffering from the virus is already so large, right? Which means that even if you engage with 10% of the people you normally engage with on a day-to-day basis, when it comes to delivery boys or when it comes to getting essentials from your shop, from your local shops, etc., the probability is still significantly higher because the distribution of the pandemic is now much higher in the United States. Consequently, effectiveness of social distancing is very controlled and very specific, right? So in that instant, if I completely follow good enough norms, even if I'm very close to a person suffering from COVID-19, it's very unlikely that I'll catch that virus from that person if I ensure that contact doesn't happen, if I ensure that I wear a mask, if I ensure social distancing and all of these things, right? This is absolutely important, because notice that the cases are probably going to rise and the virus is probably going to stay there. To that extent, if at all we are planning to opening up, even in opening opposition's world, we need to make sure that people are capable of taking up these kinds of social distance practices. Why does it not happen on opening opposition's world, right? Because notice that they rely on medical professionals to claim that now it's safe to go out. Medical professionals can't make this sort of an economic trade-off, right? Medical professionals will always support their medicine theory, etc., and say, it's still so bad, you can't go out and all of these things. States are able to make this sort of an economic trade-off in a much better way for two reasons. Firstly, states need to ensure that they are sustainable in terms of their businesses running and having enough money to ensure that they're able to fight the virus and have schemes to protect the poor people, etc. But beyond that, individual decision making also matters, right? As an individual, it's completely up to me if at all I decide that the economic trade-off is just not worth the lockdown, I'm going to go out and just take the risks regardless, right? Which means in their world, the kind of movements and the kind of movement in public spaces is significantly going to be uncontrolled. On the contrary, if we as a state voluntarily open up and tell people that these are the guidelines that you need to follow, it's much more likely that the thing that's going to happen is going to be a lot more effective. add this to the opening government's analysis on, we already have sustainable things in place, right? Where we already clean our metro stations, where we already have social distancing norms to be ensured, and we have made all of those structural changes. All of these things mean that at this particular point in time, ensuring that people follow social distancing while not making this sort of an economic trade-off is still a much more viable thing compared to on their side, where this lockdown just keeps on prolonging and people get so frustrated that at one point they just storm the roads, right? This is absolutely important for opening opposition's case to stand in this debate. But secondly, right, in the vast majority of cases, right, the effectiveness of lockdown is problematic for opening opposition, because their claim is that this thing, medical professionals suggest we'll keep letting this happen. Notice that in the vast majority of the cases, individual decision making is not a perfect way to deal with a pandemic at large, right? Why is this the case? Individual decision making is a very personal thing, right? It means that I am going to make an assessment of what I feel the risk of a virus is compared to the economic trade-offs, which mean that if the state doesn't open up, individuals are completely left to the freedom and completely left to the whim of when to go out and when to break all sorts of social distancing norms, right? What can states do in this particular instance, right? What states can effectively do is tell people is to make sure that these social distancing things are effective. But what states know at a macro level is that even if people go out and if social distancing norms are followed, even if the number of virus cases increase to a certain extent, we are able to revive the economy to that and to an extent where we are able to sustain all of the welfare schemes that we need to provide. We are able to sustain all of the other things that we need to develop in terms of infrastructure, etc. Right? This is significantly important in the context of US, where the oil industry has taken a huge hit, where a lot of other industries where workers are just not allowed to be there, means that all of those things don't happen. The reason why companies lobby states to lift the lockdown is primarily this, right? If you allow strategic opening up, we'll get much less lobbying from companies to make those norms worse, right? We are on our side, at least we are much more able to ensure that companies and people in general follow these norms. But I'll take a POI from opening.
Yeah, your case does not deal with our material about why people would not make the rational choice to social distance now. But more importantly, your case explains why people would not social distance into the future. But we explain at that point it would not be necessary for them to socially distance to the same degree.
There are three responses to this basically. Firstly, your idea of the threat won't be significant in the future probably ensures like you just have a very, very long lockdown, and I think that the economic implications are so significant that you just can't sort of strawman this idea lives are more important than these things, because if people are not able to sustain economically, that's probably either worse than death for many people, but also amounts to death because they're just not able to get food and all of those things. But beyond that, I think the second response to your claim is that in the long term, when you open up, it's just that at that point it's much more difficult to ensure that social distancing norms are followed, right? Because now your people will tell you that you had a lockdown for so long, why weren't you able to effectively hold this situation to a strong extent? Currently, when the lockdown has existed for a shorter period of time, opening up tells people that the virus is still threatening, but we acknowledge that you have economic needs to be met, which means that these are the norms that can probably minimize the threat on you of the virus, and this is much more palatable and much more easier to enforce in the vast majority of the cases. Notice that we really don't have the infrastructure to ensure that in the long term all of these norms are followed and all of those things. We need the public will to ensure that they make the right decisions, and they make these decisions that are more important on a macroscopic level, right? If we allow this lockdown to this prolong, we are just condemning ourselves to random irrational decision making at an individual level, which probably leads to a lot worse harms, right? This is seen in many individual cases across the world, right? Like when one person just erratically goes to a place and comes in contact to a lot of people without ensuring social distancing norms, and people suffer to a great extent, right? All of those things become much worse on their side of the house. On our side, we are able to do this sustainably. Very proud to be.
Everybody see me and hear me? Is that a yes? Can you guys hear me? Can they not hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. Three main things in this speech. First, I'm going to tell you why reopening early is bad economically, uniquely from a state's perspective. Second, I'm going to tell you why this is going to extend the crisis and make things much worse. Third, I'm going to tell you why the state opening is going to be uniquely bad. And keep in mind, no team in this debate has a fiat in order to mandate how things are going to go. So we're going to base this all in an analysis of how we think things are likely to go based on evidence available to us. Before I do that, I'd like to very briefly talk about what CG says. They say, any eventual opening up is going to be bad for the same reasons as we say, but we say that ignores a huge bit of analysis, right? We'd say that first, it gives us time to develop things like vaccines. It gives us time to do things like get additional ventilators and beds. It gives us 3 crucially time to like learn more about the virus, right? Like we're learning about how it multiplies, we're learning about how it's spread all the time. This allows us to develop better strategies. And then fourth, we can develop apps and implement contact tracing. I think crucially, all of these programs need to be implemented at a federal level with a high amount of collective action and buy-in from all of the states when they're doing this type of thing, right? Because when you don't have that type of collective action, then you get a way less effective implementation of the program. Secondly, they say the distribution of the pandemic is really bad. It's already so large. So like social distancing measure or like lockdown measures aren't effective because you'll get it from your delivery boy. Like what? If the probability is high, that's exactly when you want to use social distancing. So you avoid these like explicit type of exponential growth that you're talking about here. This is the thing we want to avoid. This is the reason, in fact, that we need to have this type of thing. Finally, they just say that states and individuals should be allowed to make their own economic trade-offs and that states maybe can't do this. One, we would note that on a principled level, it's not just the individual that's making the trade-off since they have the ability to infect other people. And states are also affected by the same principle since people in states affect other people in other states because there's a high amount of state commerce. Getting on into our positive material then, and a lot of this you can also cross-apply into rebuttal. First, why is reopening economically going to be bad? I think opening opposition talked a little bit about why it's going to be bad for the workers, but we're going to give you structural reasons as to why the economy is likely to be less likely to recover at the point where you have a disparate opening. One, note that most of the businesses that reopen are likely going to fail, right? One, note that they're very often no longer eligible for federal loan programs in the business district. Two, note they're no longer eligible for forgiveness programs, which exist even in the private sector. So for example, banks and mortgages have often implemented programs where they'll forgive mortgages and forgive other types of payments on these types of things. These things would no longer be available. Three, note that they would have far less leverage against landlords at the time where you don't have everyone doing this collectively, i.e. the Cheesecake Factory, a really popular American brand, just decided not to pay rent, and their landlord couldn't do anything about it because they wouldn't have been able to find another tenant, right? So you collectively, when you have all of these people that are sticking out of the economy, they have bargaining power and are able to freeze economic transactions in these cases. But note that even if that wasn't all the case, note that once you start reopening, consumers are still going to be massively cautious, right? So they're cautious about spending money generally because of a general economic downturn. They have like a loath attitude to do that. But two, they're very cautious about going into packed places like theaters, restaurants, these kind of things. It's totally unlikely that people are going to or travel. It's totally unlikely that people are going to be like going back on Carnival cruises again. This means that you have a much smaller stream of income than you actually have in terms of expenses because your revenue is low and your static costs remain basically fixed. You have mortgage, you have fixed costs of machinery, you have staff with fixed costs like health insurance because 60 to 70% of the US workforce is insured privately. You have unions, which maybe make it so that you can't fire individual staff. You have products, which you often have to buy in bulk. These are all costs which remain more or less fixed and you don't have the revenue in order to do that. And now you lose the government support, which has been taking you along during this. This means that during a partial opening, it makes it really, really bad. We would much rather prefer an opening where you have a much higher level of consumer confidence, for example, that we know much more about the disease and we have much more confident contract tracing mechanisms in place and we know more about the virus and that the long-term economic outlook is better. So if we wait and develop all of these things, consumer confidence will be higher and it's less likely that these businesses are going to incur the significant costs that they would have otherwise incurred. Why is that then really, really bad in terms of extending the crisis? We would say that what we see right now is something of a collective action problem. That is to say that the states that are the poorest, that want to invest the least amount of money in these types of things that are like the hardest up, are basically free riders when they open their economy and allow this to start generating economic output. Because when a state opens, the virus circulates within the state, right? And other states remain closed. The problem of this then is that it allows the virus to survive in individual pockets before it moves to other states, right? So because you have a high amount of state-to-state traffic in the US, because people have family, because they travel for work, these types of things, it means that the virus is basically given reservoirs by which to like stay, and then you actually get a even longer problem with the virus. Note that government can't claim, oh, well, we're flattening the curve because healthcare systems are very often overloaded on a local level. That's to say, it doesn't matter if I have extra hospital capacity in Delaware, if Colorado is overwhelmed from a hospital, right? So this like doesn't actually flatten the curve per se. It just makes a lot of little tiny high flattened curves as like the virus then goes back and forth, right? That means the virus cannot be effectively stopped and that you effectively injure the US economy and make it so that more people die over the long-term things. I would note that that is particularly impactful in terms of more people dying because the US has high rates of comorbidity, right? Like these are people that don't have a high amount of health insurance, that don't have access to hospitals, and also have a pretty high obese population, or right, which is like really, really a risk factor for COVID, right? So why is it likely then? Okay, so these are all of like the bad impact things, but then government could stand up and say, oh, well, this program is likely to be implemented well, or why do you think it will be implemented better on the federal level? Here's the reasons why state opening things are going to be uniquely bad. One, we would note that the states that open are A, disproportionately Republican, and B, disproportionately poor, right? They kind of go hand in hand a lot of the time, right? And that also means that when they apply for things like federal aid in order to pay for the workers and to subsidize their failing unemployment programs, they are less likely to get federal support, because we know that the House controls the purse strings of the entire nation. That's controlled mostly by Democrats. They're likely going to want to make a stand and say, like, we don't want states to open, so they have the incentive in order to make sure that this doesn't go to these states. Note that when you have Republicans and Trump in the state, they have a strong ethos of no handouts to workers. That is to say, the problems that we described in terms of like them no longer being eligible for handouts aren't likely to be just hand waved away, because they have the really strong ethos of like, if you are working, you're no longer eligible for government support. Even if that weren't the case, note that this is in many cases directly written into the laws of the state that aren't so easily changeable. So like on a state-by-state basis, all of the bureaucratic infrastructure around things like unemployment, around things like business subsidies are explicitly written that you can't be profitable. You know how difficult this is to change? Like cutting a non-means tested stimulus check took over a month, right? Can you imagine how long it would take in order to reallocate this, all the measures, right? The same goes for protective measures. Why is it much better on the federal level than much later? One, note that it's substantially easier to enforce broad closures in a unified way, right? So we can just reinforce broad closures, and rather than like making sure that people maintain like archaic social distancing systems, right? Two, when it's mandated on a federal level, the House is responsible for finance, which is controlled by Democrats. That means that the plan itself and the reopening plan is likely to be more science-based, because Democrats have identified science as a brand. Two, there's likely to be a higher amount of economic success and understanding, because Democrats are moving towards like a more equitable method of tax structure. Three, there's likely to be slower multilateral negotiations because they have to like cooperate with all interest actors. They're going to catch more things, craft better policy. And four, there's just going to be more money available for trading programs and compliance. The US is one of the richest countries in the world. The demand for the dollar is absolutely sovereign. It's unlikely the US will ever run out of money in terms of printing money for just a year or two. There's no reason we can't do this. It'll be much better if it's implemented on a federal level much later. For these reasons, we think you should oppose.
Just give me a second, like 10 seconds, sorry. The case coming from closing opposition is largely uncomparative. Why? Because the case was, at this point of time, businesses wouldn't flourish, banks wouldn't give loans to businesses are going to fail, fixed costs are going to rise, and hence it will be a bad business, so probably not open the economy right now. I'm going to deal with that later, but notice that if you open their business after a longer period of time, it's going to get much worse, given the fact that most of the economy is going to be going to be devastated, right? After you open up, like after a year or 6 months or 7 months, whatever. If you open it now, comparing it to opening like 6 to 7 months, the harms that the closing opposition is going to talk about is going to be the same, right? But look, on our side of the house, that probably exists for every post-financial crisis era, which means that after 2008-2009 crisis, banks didn't want to give loans to small and medium businesses because they thought they might fail as well. And probably the problem is that you still have government intervention working in these areas, right? What did US do after that, right? A lot of countries like the European Union or the United States of America realize in order to boost consumer confidence, they need to come up with economic incentives, right? One of that was QE, quantitative easing, which made sure that instead of investing in government bonds, the people like who are investors or people or big banks would start loaning out money, because if you do quantitative easing, you decrease the yield that the investors can derive out of that government bonds, which means that most of their case is about the world, what the world looks like post-COVID, like post-financial crisis, and it's largely uncomparative. And we think closing opposition is a definite fourth in this debate, right? But notice what was our case, and notice what happened a few days ago. A lot of Republican supporters came out on the streets practicing yoga, working out, that we want the gyms to open, we want the lockdown to open, we can't sustain like this. And this is what Parsha pointed out to you in his speech, right? That if you don't open the economy right now, if you don't have social guidelines, if you don't have guidelines practicing social distancing that allow people to come out, open their businesses, go to gyms, etc., practice certain rules and regulations, people are going to come down the streets, and it's going to create much more havoc and chaos on the opposition side of the house. And probably it's not going to be a good scenario, right? But let's deal with opening opposition, because I think a lot of their arguments was, oh yeah, but people are going to die, so let's not open it right now. Let's deal with them rebuttal by rebuttal, right? We think opening opposition has largely been uncomparative in this debate. They can't just argue that CDC has not allowed, advised us to open, so we should not open. WHO has not allowed us to open, so we should not open. Let's be realistic. They've also told that lockdown is not a sufficient response to this crisis. We need to deal this crisis in a much more balanced manner, which means they're okay with claiming that probably all the businesses should not open. Right now, they're okay with look, lockdown is not going to be an insufficient step. We need to do more than that. And probably that is what Parsha argued to you in his speech, right? Because look, people are not going to survive either way. People who probably depend on daily wages obviously are going to get fucked over for much because probably they can't survive for a stretch of 6 to 7 months without daily wages. You can argue that government packages do exist, but look what the government expenditure looks like right now. You have healthcare costs, you have unemployment packages, you have to bail out companies that are falling out, you have to give people food who can't afford it. But the income of government is so meager. Government enterprise is not making any money. Oil industry in US has taken a hit. Future prices have gone down negative because the barrels have completely filled up. US oil industry taking a hit. Less demand of goods and services, less consumer spending, less money with the government to spend on all those employment benefits, or the probably you can argue the model in the Nordic countries operate, right? Which means people wouldn't survive either way on opposition's bench or opposition side of the house. Given fact, they are either likely to go out on the streets and create a havoc, or rather they would say that we need to go out and open our businesses because we need to survive. There needs to be a balance, and probably we think government should open businesses at a point at which people are finding it difficult to survive, right? But look, we say that WHO, we also asked this in the POI to opening opposition, that WHO also claimed that it may never be a vaccine. And the response was, oh, but one health professional saying doesn't mean it's going to happen. But notice the contradiction. Their entire case was built on health professional guiding them to not open businesses, right? Which means that realistically, if we look at the most realistic scenario, vaccines are not near. Probably it might take an year more to get a vaccine, right? In the best case scenario. We need to learn, and probably people say that this is going to come in waves. So if the effect of coronavirus is going to get dilute right now, it might get much worse after a period of time, right? So we need to learn to live with it, practice social distancing, and keep working in order for us to make sure that people continue to survive this and the government costs don't pile up with deploring incomes, right? We need to do that. But why do we think social distancing will be pressured? Given that, and this is why we don't agree with opening opposition, because most of the claims are, oh, people are not going to follow. Hell yeah, people are going to follow because they know the threat this virus poses. They know that they have to make a trade-off between choosing, practicing social distancing and making sure that they're able to work at the particular firms, right? But look, people know about the harms of COVID. So I think if I am able to see the perceived threat of COVID and how a number of cases are piling up every day, I will make certain steps to protect myself, to probably wear a PPE, get mask, or whatever that I have with me, right? What was our case and why do we take this debate, right? Look, we argued from the perspective of long term, then long term, it's very unsustainable for the states to operate because states need money to operate on healthcare, and it's losing all its money on healthcare and other stuff with no source of future income. Long term, economy is going to cost a lot of jobs, as was little bit dealt with OJ. But in terms of long term, right, we think worst hit section has no guaranteed source of income. They need to go to jobs to earn money, and they don't have another option, which means Pasha already talked about how people are going to go out. But probably because of no vaccines and more waves that can come about, we are in a worse of situations compared to opposition is arguing, right? But three things. Why lockdown is not going to be effective? Before that, I'll take a POI if I have from opening.
Our case explains to you why the lockdown is not as disastrous as you claim right now. But if your primary concern is the economic harm of lockdown, we also explain why reopening now will lead to a second lockdown that will be more disruptive and larger. Please engage.
I think what one can say of the waves that can come about, I'm okay with having certain lockdowns in between opening businesses rather than having a stretch of lockdown in which continues millions of people suffer. There needs to be a way in which government income has some back support, and we ensure that happens on our side. But why lockdowns are not ineffective? Three reasons. We think in most number of cases, lockdowns only work when the density of viruses is not high, right? Which means probably there's a slum named Dharavi in Mumbai where people say that lockdown is not going to be effective because of the large clusters of viruses that are existing within the slums. Hundreds of cases are seen every day, which means lockdown is not going to be that, probably on a marginal basis, you can say that it's going to be effective, but not that effective in countries like America, where cases are rising up every day. There needs to be a trade-off, right? But second of all, if opening opposition wants to argue on medical professionals, they can't make the trade-off because the idea of a life loss is more important to them compared to a person losing job and dying of hunger, which means that we need money to protect people. Individuals are going to go out and flout the rules because they don't money, which means worse off opening opposition, right? But we think that oil industry taking a hit is also going to be worse off because US relies heavily on oil industry, and there's no we need to foster consumer demand in oil industry in order to make sure that economy is back on track, right? We have proved to you why this virus is, why lockdown is going to be not that effective in the status quo, given the fact that the virus has a tendency to actually multiply if the density is higher, and probably you can make sure that lockdown works in like density where density is low. We have given you reasons why in long-term strategic move government needs to do this in order to make sure that we don't suffer the long-term lockdown costs on our side. Incredibly proud to propose.
Am I audible? Okay, great. 1 second, please. Fuck my life. Okay, mute me, please. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, this is a very messy debate with a lot of assertions thrown around all about. So I'm going to try and order this in a clear way. So first, let's look at like relevant capacities on the government to influence individual behavior on both sides. Then why under government side, the lockdown is relaxed by the wrong states for the wrong reasons, and why ultimately this will lead to bad consequences both in a health perspective for the ongoing health crisis, but also in an economic perspective. Okay, first of all, what we hear from CG is this idea that like we can sustain social distancing, but we cannot sustain like a lockdown because people will protest and stuff. I know we think that's very farcical. Like we think plausibly a certain amount of people just don't really trust the government and will not really follow our guidelines and are not willing to do that. And like most people are sort of willing to go along with it. And like the far right of the Republican Party is against us. This probably is symmetric on both sides. This is, I think, also why OO can't like realistically claim that people will abide by lockdown norms, but not by social distancing norms. So what we think then is the crucial difference here is that enforcing social distancing is a lot harder than enforcing a lockdown, because a lockdown is a unified, easy to check measure. I just need to drive police cars around downtown and see if people are going into businesses or like clustering in large parties, and I can tell them to stop that. Whereas if I was to check if everyone is using hand sanitizers, everyone is keeping the exact amount of distance, and everyone is wearing PPE gear, then that's a lot harder. So we think, first of all, like our policies are simply easier to enforce with the kind of people that do not have personal buy-in. So on average, like we are going to have more people do the things we want, but we're fully willing to concede that not everyone is going to abide by the lockdown, but we also think Gov needs to concede that not everyone is going to abide by social distancing. Cool. So, then the big question is kind of which states reopen, why do they reopen, and how do they reopen? Because like both government teams assume for some reason that this policy is likely to be evidence-based and very smart and done in conjunction with experts. Now note, obviously the motion is this House supports motion, so it doesn't give them any amount of feedback. They would have to show why states are have the right incentives and the right capacities to do that. We never heard anything. Here's what we told you specifically. We told you that empirically speaking, reopening is mostly happening in Republican states. And this doesn't support the theory that the reopening is done like evidence-based, because like Corona doesn't just happen in red states, it happens in both states. The blue states just happen to not reopen because this is a partisan thing, not an evidence thing. And therefore, what explains their behavior is not evidence, but it is the partisan pressure that they specifically receive, which like New York as a democratic state doesn't receive. This is Trump, who has a lot of clout within the Republican Party and wants states to reopen to give everyone the impression that he won like the battle against Corona. This is secondly the far-right protesters, which like have relative sway within the Republican Party and drive a lot of media narratives and sort of scare like red governments into reopening. And this is lastly Fox News pumping out a lot of propaganda saying that the coronavirus is not a big deal. This pressure specifically lies on Republican states. This is why they reopen. This also then shows, because they are pressured by actors who don't have like the best interest of everyone at heart, the kind of policies they implement will also not have the best interest of everyone at heart, but instead will like reflect what Trump wants, what the protesters want, or what Fox News wants. This is why they won't be very well done, why they won't be evidence-based. This means like most of the benefits of the government case falls. This is why they cannot contain Corona very well through like proper social distancing norms, because people won't abide by it in the ways they want to, but also because ultimately the policies won't be implemented in smart ways. Cool. So, and then lastly, just there's this one idea that we have sufficient capacities to deal with Corona in case there are secondary outbreaks, said by opening government. And note that this is just an assertion. We have no idea if this is correct, but we think there's two reasons why it's likely incorrect. This is that many states are pretty poor, like especially in the South, and they don't and have like relatively bad infrastructure. They like are just physically impossible to scale all that up in a couple of months. But also a lot of states like Michigan or Colorado have openly admitted that they have insufficient capacities. So this just doesn't fly. What have we specifically told you in the debate? Because I think opening opposition does a great job in terms of explaining why there's bad health outcomes from reopening, and they do that well. But what they don't show is why the policy will be implemented in very good ways. Here's where Braden extends, specifically by showing you how a federal response is likely more coordinated and more effective, and also why when it is controlled through Democrats, it is more likely to be like science-based and evidence-oriented. The second thing, though, that we've shown you is that there is essentially no economic benefit to opening early. This is for two reasons. This is because the Democrats in the House will pressure the states that reopen early with like withdrawing certain federal aid programs, which means like a lot of the workers that still can't pay their bills because most of the businesses haven't recovered will not be able to sustain themselves. Whereas under our side, everyone would at least receive these amount of federal aid programs, which will like carry you over. But the second and important reason is there is a coordination problem in reopening the economy, aka if most consumers still don't have trust in going into restaurants because a lot of people are still scared by Corona no matter what the government says, then if you open your restaurants, you will have way fewer customers than before. So you can't employ as many people, and like you have to lay a lot of your staff off. But this staff now, and this is the important difference, does not have access to a lot of the unemployment programs. This means like the economy won't recover, and it would instead go into a downward spiral where ultimately like companies need to keep laying off staff. This will mean less people get money and can buy stuff, so demand drops even worse and then supply drops even worse. But it also means people don't at least have federal aid programs to last them over this time. But also a lot of other actors like debt collectors, like renters and landlords will not be willing to be as diligent as they were before. Ultimately, we think the US government has the money to prolong this lockdown for a couple more months. The US can borrow at essentially zero cost currently on international capital markets. This is not a problem in the debate. Reopening now will create bad health outcomes. It will be implemented in bad ways, and it will wreck our economy beyond a capacity that is reasonably recoverable. Please oppose.